I'm very pleased to be participating in the Key Thinkers series. I'm also pleased to be speaking about Knuth here because I think he is the very model of a Melbourne model graduate. In various ways which I'll talk about. He had a range of different interests and the new Melbourne model curriculum would have suited him very well. And similarly, he's the type of graduate that we would be very proud to say came to a particular institution, but I'll perhaps point that out a little bit later on. What I'm going to do in the lecture, and I hope it will be around an hour to leave some time for questions, to give you a little bit about his chronology and the history of how he got to where the various events, and then say a little bit more about some of his significant contributions. And really I'm going to focus on four. You absolutely have to talk about the art of computer programming, which has really been an icon and transformed the whole area of computer science. Tech, which is the computer typesetting program, which again has become completely iconic. And again, as some of the people here commented, that's their connection to Knuth. Something completely different, 316, which was a book on Bible analysis. So again, I'll comment on that. And he's just been able to have fun and follow some miscellaneous interests. And I'll give you some perspective of a range of different books. And I've got a collection of my Knuth library here that I'll comment on as we go. And the way the key thinker was expressed were people you admire or influence what you've done. I'll say a little bit more why my own personal admiration of Knuth at the end and why I'm really very pleased to have opportunity to say a little more about him in a public forum. And I trust you'll find out a little bit more about Knuth than you knew about before coming to the lecture. So, I guess the statutory, he was born in January 1938 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He came from a relatively not an academic background. His grandfather was a blacksmith. His father, I believe, was the first person that had a university qualification. He became a teacher in a Lutheran school. His father, in fact, was a very strong influence on Knuth, having both an interest in school and studies, and also in music, which was it continues to be a long interest of Knuth. There are two incidents from his school life that I want to talk about, which really characterise and give you a feeling of Knuth and how he did what he did. So the first one was his behaviour in 8th grade. So Ziegler apparently makes various candy bars, or chocolate bars as we'd say over here, and they launched a competition to say how many words can you make from Ziegler's giant bar. So this clearly entertained Knuth. He took 2 weeks off school and generated 4,500 words that you can make from the word. The judges had only found 2,500 words. Needless to say, he won the competition and everyone at school got a free chocolate bar, and I think they were quite happy as well. I should also say Knuth commented if he'd been able to use the apostrophe, he'd been able to get even more words. So, but again, it's typical of his systematic looking out of possibilities coming out at an early age. The other entry that I want to comment on is the Westinghouse Science Talent Search, and he entered a complete system of weights and measures, including such units as the potrzebi, or I probably should say posh, I think it's got Polish connections though, and the what me worry. Now for those of you, that should immediately be a flag to many of you for Mad magazine. And indeed, that was, you might be interested, the potrzebi is the equivalent to the thickness of Mad magazine issue number 26, which is 2.2633485, and Knuth actually specified it to 20 decimal places. He had various other collections of units. He also related it to the appropriate wavelength of cadmium. So again, an attention to detail and a sense of humour characterised him from the beginning. Mad magazine was actually taken it, so this is actually Knuth's first publication. which was published in Mad Magazine number 33, The Potrzebi System of Weights and Measures, and with some various accommodation. They claim it's being used in Afghanistan or various other odd places in typical Mad Magazine style. But I have to say, I'm envious. Mad Magazine is something that was a big influence on my sense of humour. I would have loved to say my first publication was in Mad Magazine. It's a good start, and again, perhaps characterises what Knuth had done. So he went to school at a Lutheran high school from 1952 to 1956, and he then went to college at Case Institute of Technology. He had an interest in music, and again, he'd spent a lot of time playing. His father was a church organist, so he actually played quite a bit of music, but he got persuaded, and I think he got a physics scholarship to start at Case. But what happened that transformed his life when he joined Case was they had one of these new, it had recently been placed at the university, an IBM 650. And he got the manual, taught himself how to program, and spent many hours with the IBM 650. And indeed, there is a quote in the front cover of the Art of Computer Programming dedicated to the Case 650 program. There's a picture of a 650, courtesy of the internet. And again, this is 1956 when he started programming it. He found lots of programs to look at. Of course, he had nerdish characteristics. So again, his interest in sport was being scorer. And he also decided he was ahead of his time. He managed to write a statistics program for analysing the form of the basketball team. And apparently this got some publicity, and IBM had some interest in sharing it further. I couldn't resist seeing it was 1956 when Knuth started to program on this IBM 650 to point out that 1956 was also the time that computers came to the University of Melbourne, and many of you I know have seen a picture on the left, which is CSIRAC, which there actually was a picture taken a bit earlier than that, the early 50s, but that machine was the first computer at the University of Melbourne. And in fact, it has been restored at the Melbourne Museum. So those of you that haven't been there, it's actually the oldest intact computer on exhibit. But it's quite a different view of a computer and a computer environment at Melbourne than there was at Case. So we were a little bit behind. So Knuth, what happened with his undergraduate, that really was a remarkable period, and he showed his particular abilities. As I mentioned, he'd started off as a physics graduate, but he clearly had interest and passion for mathematics and switched majors. There is a story that one of the maths classes said, "I will give you an A if you solve a problem, and you don't have to come to the rest of class." And sure enough, Knuth did that and spent the rest of the time. Felt slightly guilty that he got an easy A, but ended up tutoring the subject later on otherwise. But the thing that was truly remarkable was the following. In his fourth year, so this is in the first half of 1960, when he submitted his undergraduate project, it was probably some kind of capstone project, the faculty all universally agreed that he should be awarded a master's thesis for his project. And again, when I was teaching, Liz mentioned I taught at Case later, there were some people that were there that said he was just in a class above anyone else in what he was able to do. And in fact, he's the only person I know where that's happened, where this spontaneous recognition of awarding a master's for an undergraduate project. He also had published a couple of papers in journals on mathematics and how we're kind of doing algorithmic things within maths. And he had 3 offers of scholarships to various institutions across the US. He eventually chose to go west and went to Caltech and started there in the fall of 1960. He married in 1961 and had children born in 1965 and 1966. He graduated in 1963, and his advisor at Caltech, it was in fact in mathematics, but it was also in group theory. And Marshall Hall was his PhD advisor, who's a very eminent group theorist. Again, Knuth's interest was probably more on the computing side and algorithms than on the mathematics. And in fact, again, it was almost a sidelight. He was able to convert an algorithm into a proof which solved a particular class of problems. And Marshall Hall was enlightened enough to say, just write that up as a thesis and go and do the other things that you do effectively. So he was actually quite efficient in getting a thesis. But he was recognised, and he stayed at Caltech. He'd started lecturing while he was, I guess, in his second year of his PhD, and stayed there through till 1968. Again, his programming ability, he'd started in 56 as a freshman at Case. Clearly was good at it and wrote all of these programs. That was recognised. In his time between he graduated probably in May 1960, and when he started his graduate school, probably September 1960, he said, well, what can I do to earn some money or get a job? So they said, maybe I'll write an ALGOL compiler. So he had actually a job and earned $5,500 to write an ALGOL compiler. And it's interesting negotiations of, they bargained large amounts of scope. So that's kind of way under what the going rate was, but it's still pretty good pay for an undergraduate student. But he clearly had the ability to write compilers and understand programming languages. Afterwards, because he was able, in the case of 3 months, to write a fully correct, a useful compiler, apparently he was approached by a startup company saying, we would like you to join us and we will sell compilers that you write. And his response was to try and come up with a number that he thought was so much. So I said, okay, if you give me $100,000. And they wanted to continue the conversation. And Knuth said, no, I really don't want to go and have my ideas sold as a particular area. I'm really more interested in the academic pursuits. And that's been very consistent in his behaviour over his career, that he was certainly interested in the greater good and disseminator of knowledge and not making money out of the particular areas that he worked in. He stayed on, so Burroughs recognised the talent that he could write compilers for them. I think the compiler was in fact for Burroughs, and he stayed doing consulting work and probably getting good. And again, I'm sure they appreciated his technical programming skills. He kept doing programming work all the way through till 1968. He also read voraciously in the whole area of programming languages, and that was where he was getting academic content. So he was the editor for the programming languages for ACM publications for 4 years around that period of time. And he was just really the prototype expert on how you wrote programming languages and compilers. So we mentioned really what changed his life, and again changed the course of computer science was the art of computer programming. In the corner, many of you will recognise the old volumes as how they appeared in their yellow covers. I'm sure many of you have at least seen, have copies, or if not, seen them. Here is the new reissued, spiffy volumes in a larger picture. But it started, he was approached by Addison Wesley to write a book on compilers in 1962. So in Knuth's typical style, he said, well, I'll take this seriously. And he spent a lot of time reading all of the journals. And a couple of years later, he turned up to Addison Wesley with 3,000 handwritten pages describing what he said about compilers. And people looked and said, that's actually more than what we need to know. Really, we should rescope this exercise. And they envisaged the 7-volume series of the art of computer programming that is still in progress. I'll comment on a little bit more. He then went back and restructured the 3,000 pages into a range of different volumes. The first volume was published in 1968. The second volume, shortly afterwards, because that was kind of a lot of the materials, the basic algorithms, which was published in 1969. And the third volume was published in 1973. But already with the first volume, it had an absolute immediate impact. And I remember someone showing me when I was still at high school, Knuth's volume, saying, wow, this is what computing can be. and it made a quantum change to how you thought about computing, from just being a hobbyist to something that was a serious academic pursuit. So on the basis of the book, so that was published in 1968, Stanford actually offered him a professorship in computer science at age 30. So it's a very early age to be offered it, and it was a very good decision. He certainly was a strong influence, so that's a good way of spotting and supporting talent. And he had his choice, in fact, so he had many offers, so the ability of the book was clear, and he went round. One of the reasons for Stanford that he chose was that he was able to recruit probably his closest academic colleague, which was Robert Floyd, who got a Turing Award a few years later from Knuth. And it was interesting, I hadn't quite realised until I prepared for the talk, the similarities. Both of them learnt programming the same year, started programming in 1956, and both had a passion to try and come up with mathematically elegant ways of describing programming, really transferring programming from just what people did to doing something that was elegant and defendable mathematically and was rigorous. He was a colleague in that endeavour. So once Knuth's reputation kept growing, he got appointed to be the Fletcher Jones Professor in 1977. And for those outside the US system, having a named chair is much, much more prestigious than a regular chair. That means you've actually got endowment income, another one, so you've got a major step forward. And Knuth is in a class of his own. In 1990, they changed his title to be the Professor of the Art of Computer Programming. And again, that's unprecedented. I haven't seen anyone named after a book, but at some level it was testimony to the uniqueness of it. But at that stage in the range of things, he effectively said, I just want to get back to doing my book, let me do it. And again, I think that feeling was he was allowed to do it. So he actually became, and is currently, the Emeritus Professor of the Art of Computer Programming at Stanford, and free to do what he wants. And he gives lectures every now and again, and chatting to at least someone here that was at Stanford a few years ago, so he still goes around and gives appropriate sets of lectures and gets invited, but is trying to complete and is progressing with the art of computer programming. And some of his fascicles from Volume 4 are outside on the book table. The other thing which, again, is notable about his time in Stanford is he lives on the Stanford campus or close by, and he has a large pipe organ in his house, which was, again, kind of noticeable. Some of the people that said the first thing I met with Knuth is, gee, it's an amazing organ, a full-size organ, where he's able to play in his own house, which is quite remarkable. Okay, so at that stage, as Knuth developed in the area, he made two decisions which I've got a lot of time for and respect for, which are interesting. One was his attitude to journals. So he really was a prolific reader and read all of the sets of journals. Sometime in the mid-80s, he said, I can't read all of the journals anymore. I'm only going to read where I can up to, and he said, with some promise to do later on. So that's kind of an image that he have, still collecting the journals and someday hoping to get back to the set of knowledge. But I think it's actually typical where he started, where you're able to know all the things that people would write, is no longer possible. And Knuth was an early recognizer of what you need to do, how you are selective in what you choose to read or not. And the other one, which was interesting, is his email policy. And the 1st of January, when he became the Art of Computer Programming professor, he removed his email account from the Stanford system. And I like some of these range of statements. He said he started using email in 1975, which was clearly the ARPANET, which was kind of an early adopter of internet, and said, it seemed to me 15 years of email use is plenty for one lifetime. And the next line is, I really like, email is a wonderful thing for people whose role in life is to be on top of things. My role is to be on the bottom of things, so therefore I don't want to need it. And again, it's just a distraction. If you really need the concentration that is necessary to do the kind of careful work that he does, email is a distraction. He's actually kept to that. And I can't quite bring myself to do it, but it's quite an inspiration for those that you want justification to do less email. You've got a very high precedent to be able to follow. The last thing I do in a chronology before I get to the significant parts is to talk about the awards. And the awards really started flowing in at a rapid rate from once the Art of Computer Programming got awarded. So the ACM Grace Hopper Award, I think he was the first constituent for a young computer scientist. ACM is the main US computing organization, was awarded to him in 1971. And the most famous computing award, the Nobel Prize equivalent for computer sciences, the Turing Award, was awarded to Knuth in 1974. His citation, and that probably isn't readable, but the citation which you give for the awards are major contributions to the analysis of algorithms and the design of programming languages, and in particular for his contributions to the art of computer programming through his well-known books in the continuous series by this title. And again, I'm not talking about those maths contributions, which were significant enough, but what was transformative and why he got the award was the enormity of the contribution of the art of computer programming. He was awarded a National Medal of Science by President Jimmy Carter in 1979. And the next one, he got the Gold Medal Award for the Case Alumni Association, which actually probably isn't the most prestigious award, but was an excuse for me to say that I've actually met him personally. He came to Case to give a lecture on honour of his being given a Gold Medal Award, and I'll comment on that later. That's actually where I found out about his attitude towards journals. He explained quite carefully at that time, I've stopped reading journals, I'll only read what people recommend to me, and someday I'll catch up, but I don't know when that is. More fittingly, there was an IEEE John von Neumann Medal, the Kyoto Prize, which is apparently the Japanese equivalent of the Nobel Prize, was awarded in 1996. And on Knuth's resume, which is available on the internet, there's just 2 pages of all of the honours. It's just mind-blowing, the number of awards and whatever else that he's delivered. To give you some perspective, I did find this graph, which is the age of Turing Award winners. So the scale is the year, so that's the first Turing Award was given in the late 1960s, and this is the age. The red dot is Knuth. So he's significantly the youngest award winner of the Turing Award at age 35 for the scope of the art of computer programming. And no other person has been anywhere near as young as he has in terms of a contribution. So again, he really was a standout in the computing science area. Okay, so much for the chronology, and now let me comment on sets of accomplishments. We have to start with the art of computer programming. Why is it so significant? And really, a couple of things. And as I was preparing, really the thing that struck me is that the book really made computer science an academic discipline. And there's a danger where you think about program computing is just a computational skill. And I remember growing up, you'd think of people going to the equivalent of TAFE to just learn how to do a computation machine or other machine. What are you actually doing? But what Knuth did was say there's some really detailed, elegant mathematics underlying it, and that's what's going to get us to write much better programs, is by really taking a serious look at the academic roots. And at the time it was written, it wasn't viewed as a field. There were probably 3 main areas which people were working on. One was numeric computations, so ways of doing a whole lot of numeric computations. That was, in a way, when I first joined the University of Melbourne, what computer science was. It was just numeric computation. There was significant work in artificial intelligence, people trying to make intelligent machines, and also people on programming languages and compilers. And there were 3 areas, and what this book tried to underline what were the algorithms and the disciplines underlying all of it. And that's what the book did. And by focusing on the algorithms and their complexity, he managed to really found the basis of a discipline. And he was also the first person that was really brought the elegance of mathematics to programming. Again, so there are various other people that thought about it, but he really is a skilled and gifted mathematician and took the expression of how you could actually describe programming appropriate. And he was a class above some of the other people that were looking at programming previously, and that mathematical perspective and the elegance of the decisions really made the art of computer programming significant and study books. This is in Knuth's own words. What he did do when he was writing the field was have a single voice for the whole range of works. And as many of you know, when you try and write a textbook, which is just a collection of papers, getting a single voice where you can really compare and understand what the voice is difficult. And if you've got a particular ideology, that's also difficult as well. What Knuth did, starting out as his voice as being a graduate student without any particular area, he took on himself as saying, I really want to represent what the field says in a single voice without any particular view, and he was really very successful at it, and it stood the test of time because of it. And really the issue is the degree of care in that book is extraordinary, and that was what he did. The careful analysis and the high standards of decision have been a hallmark. As Knuth said himself in the book, I didn't just want to say that one program ran faster than another. I wanted it to say it ran 12% faster with very reliable, robust measures of what actually happened. And he was very careful and defined absolutely everything to be able to say statements very precisely and really set a standard that other people have built on. And perhaps the last comment is the whole, perhaps somewhat controversial title, Computer Program as an Art. And again, a lot of people saying, well, it became a science, and what is the difference between it? And I guess Knuth kept a description of it, and I'll read a little bit about from his lecture when he was awarded the Turing Award. It's quite worth reading about art versus science. An interesting comment, he said, medieval times, the first universities were established to teach the 7 so-called liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy. Interestingly, several of those are suitable as basis for computer science. So liberal arts has shifted since then, but going back to a basic art is an interesting area to look at. But having certainly notions of elegance, certainly pride in what you do, were all part of what got brought about in the book. So having said he made computer science a field, I guess I can't resist the opportunity in a public lecture to talk about computer science. What is it? Many people know better in the audience, know better than I do, but it's worth commenting. So here's the Wikipedia definition, and it really is building on appropriate theoretical foundations of information and computation and being able to translate them into practical techniques to build computer systems. And what Knuth would have done is, in this, perhaps second one, the systematic study of algorithmic processes that describe and transform information. The last comment is perhaps what I do want to say a couple of words on. The general public sometimes confuses computer science with vocational areas that deal with computers. I know I certainly have that frustration. If I say I'm a computer scientist, they're saying, well, I've got this problem with Windows, do you know how to fix it? Or, having network problems, and of course I know absolutely nothing about that area, and that's not what computer science does. But that's the inevitable conclusion and confusion that people had. A few years ago, I was at a conference in North America of heads of computer science departments, and the invited talk at dinner was by William Wolfe, who was the chairman of the Academy of Sciences in the US, saying that IT really suffered from that problem, perhaps worse than other areas, that people confuse a range of things. They confuse the skills that you need in order to operate computers. They confuse the infrastructure that you need, the networks and the hard drives and the devices, and the actual intellectual content between them. And people will say, well, I'm supporting your discipline by giving you infrastructure or by providing low-level training. And actually is true when you read in the media, when people say they're supporting your area, that confusion is rife. So I came back from that talk trying to be very good at making those distinctions and repeating that line several times, and I gave up after a while. It's very hard to fight that level of confusion and association that people have. And maybe there's an interesting area, understanding where the boundary is and the skill set where people just need training versus having to understand the deep mathematics is still an issue. And again, we struggle a little bit with our computer science curriculum today about how much people want to know deep mathematics versus how much people want to know how to do things. So perhaps revisiting where the confusion is and how people should look at that is worth reconsidering from time to time.